I didn't manage to get to the subtlety that I wanted to get to that I'm calling the theological political problem of Zizek. Uh, this I locate in his claim. One avenue to it is his claim that against the earlier Marxist thinkers who, in some way, believed that the exterior world or physis, nature, was trying to um, help them, somehow striving to help them, somehow had in its the law of nature, as it were coordinated to something along whatever takes the place of human teleology. Um, when in the post-Hegelian discussion, um, teleology is denied in some sense, but it's expected nonetheless. Um, Zizek moves sort of between Marx and Kant in the Hegelian space, but at the same time he presents his so-called atheism. This is where his position errors due to his personality or his character. Um, he insists that the external things, so for instance, right now he's talking about COVID. COVID is a blind, stupid mechanism. Whereas human beings, when he talks about human beings, he goes into his Freudianism or Lacanianism, because with human beings, everything is structured according to these little bits of space that are opened up where you can have coffee without milk or coffee without cream, and it's somehow for us different. They're different objects. But in any case, whether that's sufficient or not to point to what he's going to, in any case, there's a radical difference between what's going on with human beings and what's going on independently in exterior nature. The air here is very subtle. It's the claim that one can assign a neutrality to exterior nature. That makes no sense, because where are you getting the ground? And it has to do with his characterological feature that he thinks that's the tougher position. You see, that's what it is. But it's not the tougher position because it's not true. That's the problem. So you're trying to present yourself as being the first one to embrace this position, which everyone else has failed to live in. And he gives, for example, let's say the somewhat morally shocking example of if his son were to die and he heard that the son wasn't in any pain, then he'd say, okay, fine, and then he'd just go off and have dinner and no problem. That's sort of the ethos or mood of it. But the exact claim is of this neutrality. How are we? There's. I'll have to do something else on this to make it more clear. But how is it that from within the symbolic space of humans, let's make it more clear, from within space A, the human space, where things are different, we're able to get to this concept of the neutral motor of nature? Why would it be neutral? Aren't we? This is simply to. This is I'll call it a sub-Spinozian position. It's obviously defective from the position of Spinoza and Strauss, because Of course, Spinoza says you can't have a kingdom within a kingdom. So it's just one makes a kingdom, human beings, and then says, oh, there's another kingdom where everything is really cold, mechanical, there's a mechanism, it's harsh, etc. But somehow within that, there's an illusion of the this little bit of Freudian space in the coffee without cream and the coffee without milk, and then furthermore, we're supposed to achieve a perfect reconciliation of this in some way. The whole position is off kilter. I'm going to have to think it through more closely to present it more closely, but I'm just given rough sort of probedeutic in order to orient it myself and anyone else that's interested to this problem, that the whole position in a very nuanced way doesn't make sense. Okay, so then how does this have to do with faith? This, I think, the Spinoza position reminds us of this. In the popular discussion, you have often a dumb enunciation of this claim, which is supposed to be derivative on Feuerbach or some high authority, but it's really just a sort of everyday talk, where to say God is really just us, it's the human beings. But this is totally just empty talk, because what are we talking about here? Isn't the human being part of nature? Then you're assuming some kind of split, and then say God is on the side of the human being. But isn't the human being just as much part of nature as anything else? So then you have to specify how is that happening, and what's happening, and what are we talking about? So when Spinoza points out, for instance, that the word God is often used, I'm not sure if he's talking about in rabbinical text, or I think he's talking about the books of Moses, simply to mean what's going on within the human being. So we make this distinction from the philosophical side of it, which is very simple, between physis, the exterior world, and suke, the interior world. And then you say, when there's an insight, a radical insight, you can ascribe that to physis, or the interior world, or when there's talk of cause, for instance, you can ascribe that to the interior world. And then you could say something like, if we have a theory that there's such a thing as a quote-unquote universe, all things are rolled or versed into one. If we have this metaphysical theory of a universe, and correspondingly a theory of the causality of the universe, why things come to pass at all, what's the law of the universe, or the law of nature, then the position of this as being interior or exterior is radically ambivalent. So some people call it, so then you get what comes out in a symptom of this is if you speak to people who are simply allergic to the very word God. For instance, this happens with the Brights and such people. You get the feeling that if the word God is spoken, they'll have what Zizek is calling the so-called Goebbels reaction, or the Nazi propagandist who did the Total War speech. I'm forgetting the name, but Joseph Goebbels, right? So if you have this Goebbels reaction just to the word God, then you're not able to see that the question of whether this is happening within or without, it doesn't settle anything for thought. It doesn't settle anything. There's inner objects, there's exterior objects, and they seem to be what seems to be worked out in the Prussian period immediately before Heidegger was that you can move back and forth. between viewing causality as something in nature and viewing causality as a feature of human interpretation. And likewise, if God is thought as a first mover, as the cause of everything that happens in the universe, then you can likewise jump back and forth either way. So it doesn't get us anywhere just to say, oh, it's us, it's our invention, because what's happening in the so-called suke or in us is we could as easily say it's autonomous. Are we clearly wrong in saying it's what happens within us is autonomous? It's not obvious what we are. So, in relation to everything that comes forth, the question of faith here doesn't really. The question of faith hasn't really come in yet here yet, but Spinoza is moving in this territory where he's starting to see this kingdom within the kingdom problem, right? So if you have, but let's give a simple, sort of like a Catholic, straightforward synopsis, let's say, précis on the faith question. This question moves on one level in a philosophic dimension where you have the question of knowledge, opinion, and various forms of opinion, whether the opinion's on a more or less solid ground or not, and then something like authority. So just if you begin with something like I see yellow flowers, sour grass, this is a kind of knowledge. It doesn't require opinion. But if you say, I think in 10 minutes, the temperature will not have changed very much. There's a kind of cool breeze out, and probably that breeze, even if it dies down for a minute, it will continue. Then you have an opinion. It could be wrong. We're not really looking at the phenomena. It could be an opinion about something which has already happened. Anything that you could talk about, and then you can go check to see if you're right or wrong, but you're not sure because you don't have it right before you, we could regard as an opinion. Then you have other cases where somebody that we trust makes a report to us on one issue or another. And if we really think they're reliable, like when you read Leo Strauss, you think a lot of things he says are very reliable, and sometimes there are things that we could go and check for ourselves. And sometimes there's some problems, sometimes there's not. Those are questions of authority and faith in a certain way. So I might have faith that when Leo Strauss says that in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, there was, in contrast to modern Hebrew, there was no word corresponding to being in the Aristotelian sense. And that he demonstrates that, at least he gives that authority by mentioning that a word had to be coined by the rabbis in order to treat with this Aristotelian concept, which wouldn't have been necessary to coin such a word if it already existed. Other such things are matters of faith in some sense. Then you have claims which supposedly, in quote unquote, in principle, cannot be demonstrated. Sometimes one can doubt whether they can't be demonstrated in principle. Like something like the zombie problem presents itself as something which, the philosophic zombie problem presents itself as, we cannot prove the quote unquote consciousness of the other beings, but we might take it on faith. This is a case which sort of approaches what I was getting at before with the Judaism as it was, and then Judaism when it has to face modern criticism, modern critical consciousness, historical consciousness, and so on. Then once you can see how one doesn't need to raise such a question as the zombie question, but then maybe not in the case of the zombie question. For some people, might take that as unavoidable, but in other critical instances, it seems that intellectual probity demands that once a question is raised, that we can't simply ignore it anymore. Um, there's other senses of faith. So there's a sense of faith as a theological virtue, which means that faith means that um, you see and then you believe. So you see Christ Logos. You see not in nature and apparently not in the suke, but somehow, I suppose this, from the philosophic view, would say with the eyes of the soul. Heidegger uses that phrase often. You see somehow this possibility of having the Christ consciousness, which is a collective consciousness. In other words, it's a consciousness which is good for the human race, for somebody to have that personality or daimon active in them. And you see that it's somehow, it's a possibility, or that it actually exists already, but you're just not able to stably remain in it. And seeing that, this is faith in the sense where it goes along with the other theological virtues, such as hope. So, because hope doesn't mean that you've seen it and you know. So it sees that faith in that sense doesn't mean that we know, in the sense that you know that a tree is in front of you or something like that. But it just means that you had a glimpse. You saw, you see, so you believe. And then you can add, in addition to that, hope, which means not that you know and therefore you're optimistic and therefore you think you'll get there, but rather you're exposed to this radical position where it might be so. How the question, there's other questions, so we should go to the question of what faith means in connection to the Hebrew prophets. So this is, in some sense, similar to the case of authority. There's somebody who we think is reliable, and then we get somebody tells us they said something. There's a notion, either in the text that we take it that the text is on a reliable basis, or we get something as with these the commandments connected to Noah, which are brought down through oral tradition rather than, and therefore ignored by the Catholic Church. But in Judaism, they're brought down by largely taken less seriously because they're not in the Hebrew Bible. But many of these, so the authority of an oral tradition could be, in one sense, of faith. Some of these oral, and then the question of whether that's genuinely faith, because sometimes they can be confirmed into the standard of knowledge in this general sense, such as this question of everyone with the last name Cohen is supposedly descended from Abraham, and then you find out through genetic information that there seems to be some sense to that that claim of that oral tradition. Some of these oral traditions are proven to be fairly reliable by that standard. But we should go into some other senses of what faith means and how this connects to this Spinoza's attempt to reshape the tradition.